The cold was relentless. It gnawed at James's bones, biting through his worn-out jacket and making him wish he could just curl up and sleep through it all. The streets of the city were filled with shadows, even in the middle of the day. People bustled through the snow-covered roads, keeping their heads down, pulling their coats tighter around them. No one had time for kindness. No one had time for anything but survival. James wasn't any different. Once a proud man with a good job in the city's tech sector, he now found himself struggling to keep his head above water. His savings were gone. His job had been lost, and the tiny room he rented was all he could afford. Every credit he earned went straight into food or keeping the heat on, and even that barely lasted. But today was different. Today he was out of credits. There was nothing left in his wallet. All he had was a small bag of dried food and a worn-out blanket to keep him warm. As James walked past the crowded market, a sound caught his attention. It was a soft noise, almost a whimper. He slowed his pace, curiosity getting the best of him. The market was filled with traders haggling over prices, loud and chaotic. But in the midst of it all, he saw her. A woman. No, not a woman. An alien. Sat, huddled on the ground, her back pressed against a wall. She was trembling violently, her skin a pale blue that shimmered under the dim lights of the market. Her clothes were tattered, barely offering any protection from the harsh cold. The crowd around her ignored her, too busy to care, too cold to spare a thought for someone else's suffering. James stopped. His eyes locked onto her, and for a moment everything else faded. She was beautiful, in a way that he couldn't quite explain. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal, with eyes that seemed to shimmer like distant stars. Despite the freezing weather, she was barefoot, and the cold seemed to be taking its toll on her more than anyone else in the crowd. Her whole body shook, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to keep warm. Without thinking, James reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the few credits he had left. His heart pounded in his chest. He didn't have much, but what he had, he couldn't just walk away from her. He couldn't ignore her like everyone else. He made his way toward the vendor selling blankets. The blanket was cheap, rough and thin, but it was better than nothing. He handed over his last credit. It felt like a lifetime before the vendor handed him the faded cloth, and as he walked back, he could feel the weight of his decision. There was no turning back now. He crouched down in front of the alien woman. She didn't look up at first, lost in her own world of cold and fear. Slowly, he unfolded the blanket and draped it over her shoulders, trying to shield her from the biting wind. Her eyes flickered open, locking with his for the first time. For a brief moment, he saw something in those eyes. Surprise, gratitude, but also a deep sadness that cut through him like a blade. "Are you okay?" James asked, his voice quieter than he meant. He had no idea how to speak to her. What do you say to someone who clearly doesn't belong in this world? The alien woman stared at him, her voice soft yet oddly melodic. I don't know." She shivered, drawing the blanket tighter around her. "I don't belong here." James nodded, understanding the words but not the meaning. It was clear she was in trouble, more than just freezing on the streets. She wasn't from this planet. He could tell from her strange appearance and the way the cold seemed to affect her more than it did anyone else. His heart went out to her. "I'm James," he said, offering her his hand. "I don't have much, but I can get you to shelter." She hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. Her skin was cold to the touch, but her grip was strong. "I am Alara," she said, her voice soft but carrying a quiet strength. "Thank you, I don't know why you did this, but thank you." James looked at her, unsure of what to say next. He had no idea who she was, or why she was here, but he couldn't leave her out here to die. He didn't have much to offer, but he would do what he could. Alara's eyes flickered to the blanket he had wrapped around her. The cold seemed to subside slightly with the warmth of the cloth, but she still looked uneasy, as if the blanket alone couldn't ease the chill that ran deeper than just the temperature. "I'll take you to my place," James said, his voice firm, as he stood and offered his arm to help her rise. It's not much, but it'll be warmer than the streets. Alara stood slowly, her body stiff with cold and exhaustion. I don't want to be a burden, she whispered, looking down at her bare feet, her voice laced with a strange kind of sorrow. James shook his head. You're not a burden. You just need a safe place to rest. We'll figure things out. The two of them walked down the dimly lit streets, the quiet clatter of the city behind them. Alara's footsteps were slow, as if each one took more effort than the last. James kept an eye on her, worried that she might collapse any moment, but she seemed to gather strength as they moved closer to his apartment. When they arrived at his building, James unlocked the door and led her inside. The place was small, just a cramped room with a cot, a small table, and barely enough space to move around. The walls were cold, and the heating system barely worked, but it was better than the streets. James took off his jacket and tossed it onto the table before turning to face Alara. She had sat down on the cot, the blanket still wrapped around her, like a cocoon. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, and for a moment he wondered how long she had been out here, how far she had traveled to end up on this freezing planet. Alara, he said quietly, his voice gentle. You're safe here. For now? Her eyes met his again, and she smiled faintly, the first genuine expression he had seen from her since their meeting. Thank you, James. I will repay you somehow when I can. James shook his head. No need for that. I didn't do this for repayment. As the two of them sat in silence, the weight of the moment settled in. Alara was safe for the night, but James knew this was only the beginning of something much bigger. He had no idea what Alara's story was or what danger she was running from, but something told him that his life was about to change forever. James could feel the weight of the long day pressing down on him as he closed the door behind them. The room was small, dimly lit by a flickering lamp on the corner table. He had little, but it was home, and for now, it would be enough. Alara had collapsed onto the cot, still wrapped tightly in the blanket he had bought. She looked so fragile, so different from the strong, confident woman he had imagined when he first saw her. There was something about her presence that made everything feel significant, as if somehow the world had changed in that one act of kindness. He rubbed his tired eyes, noticing how cold the room was. The heater did its best, but the chill from the outside never seemed to leave. With a soft sigh, James took off his shoes, stretched his sore feet, and walked over to the small kitchenette. There wasn't much there, some dried beans, a half-empty jar of coffee, and a couple of old stale crackers. As he moved around the kitchen, Alara's quiet voice broke the silence. James, she said softly, her tone a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. You didn't have to do this. I'm a stranger to you. James paused, turning to face her. Her eyes met his from across the room. There was a strange sadness in them, but also an honesty that he found refreshing. I couldn't just leave you out there, he replied, his voice low. No one should have to face that kind of cold, especially not someone like you. She looked away, for a moment as if unsure how to respond. After a brief silence, she spoke again, her voice trembling. I'm not from here, she said, her words laced with an unspoken pain. I don't belong on this planet. James felt a wave of sympathy wash over him. There was something so vulnerable in her voice, something so real. He had always heard stories of the aliens who visited or passed through, but he had never thought he would meet one like her. Where are you from? He asked, moving closer to her. He set the jar of coffee down on the table, the question coming out more curious than he intended. Alara's eyes flickered briefly, and for a moment she seemed far away, lost in her thoughts. When she looked back at him, her expression was one of quiet strength mixed with a deep, almost invisible sadness. It's a long story, she said, her voice quiet but firm. A story I'm not sure I should share. But I will tell you this. I am running from something. Someone. James sat down across from her, giving her space. He could see that she was struggling with how much to reveal. He wasn't in a hurry to push her. After all, he wasn't even sure why she had trusted him enough to come here. But he was curious. Curious in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. I'm not the kind of man to pry, he said, his voice gentle. But if you need a place to stay, you're welcome here as long as you need. Ilara didn't speak for a long time. She just sat there looking down at her hands. James wondered if she was contemplating whether she should tell him more, or if she simply didn't know how. Finally, she broke the silence again. "I'm being hunted," she said, her voice tight, almost as if saying the words hurt her. "By people from my home. They know I escaped, and they won't stop until they find me." James was silent for a moment, processing her words. He had expected her to be from another planet, but the gravity of her situation hadn't quite hit him yet. "What did you do to make them want to hunt you?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with concern. Ilara's eyes were shadowed as she looked up at him. The days passed slowly in the small, dimly lit apartment. James wasn't used to having someone around, especially not someone like Ilara. Her presence had a strange effect on him. Sometimes it felt like she was a breath of fresh air, and at other times it felt like there was a weight in the room that he couldn't quite shake. But more than anything, her vulnerability stirred something deep within him. She was running from something terrible, and despite everything she had been through, she was still here, still breathing. He woke up early every day, still carrying the weight of his financial troubles, but there was something different now, something that made him push through. He couldn't ignore the way Ilara made him feel. It wasn't just because she was an alien. It was the way she seemed so calm, even when the world around her was falling apart. The way her eyes, though distant at times, were so open, so raw. James had always been a solitary man, keeping to himself, never getting too close to anyone. But now he found himself talking to Ilara more than he had with anyone in years. They spoke about small things at first, about the weather, about food, about what had brought them both to the city. But over time, those conversations deepened, and something unspoken passed between them. A bond began to form. One evening, as the sky outside darkened and the cold settled into the walls of the apartment, James returned from a nearby market with a small sack of food. He had learned quickly that Ilara's strange diet required some adjustments, but he was willing to try. Tonight he had bought some fresh fruit, something to make the evening feel less dreary. He set the bag on the table and turned to see Ilara, sitting by the window, her eyes lost in the view of the city skyline. "Still not used to it, huh?" James asked as he walked over to her. Ilara glanced up, her eyes shifting from the window to him. "No," she said softly. "I don't think I ever will be." James sat next to her, noticing how small she looked in the dim light. Her posture was stiff, but there was a certain grace about her that made her stand out. He had never met anyone like her. Alien or not, there was something familiar in the way she carried herself, something human. "You know," James began, trying to make the conversation light, "I think this place could use some decoration. It looks pretty bare, doesn't it?" Ilara gave a small smile, though her eyes were still distant. "I don't need much, James. I've gotten used to having nothing." James paused, unsure of how to respond. He wanted to change the subject, to distract her from the sadness that seemed to settle around her like an invisible cloud, but something stopped him. He couldn't ignore it. "You know you don't have to hide everything," he said gently, his voice careful. Ilara's smile faded and she turned her gaze to the floor. "I'm not hiding," she replied, her voice quieter now. "I just don't know how to talk about it." There was a long silence between them. James could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, thick and heavy. The space between them was filled with unspoken understanding, an understanding that only grew stronger with time. "I'm not asking you to tell me everything," James said, his tone steady. "But if you ever want to talk about anything, I'm here." Ilara finally looked at him, her eyes wide with something that resembled surprise. "You'd really listen? After everything I've told you?" James nodded, not breaking eye contact. "Of course, I'm not here to judge you. You don't have to explain anything if you don't want to. But if you ever feel like you can, I'll listen." There was something in Ilara's eyes, something fragile, as if she was considering letting him in. She looked down at her hands playing with the edges of her blanket, lost in thought. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer now, almost like a whisper. "When I was young, I was chosen for something I didn't want," she said, her words slow and measured. "My people have a system, a way of choosing who will be important, who will serve. And I was one of those who were marked for a certain role, one I didn't understand, one I didn't agree with." James listened intently, his eyes fixed on her as she spoke. The weight of her words settled on him like a blanket, heavy but comforting. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew it was important. This was the first time she had opened up to him, the first time she had let him in. "I didn't want to be a weapon," Ilara continued, her voice shaking slightly. "I didn't want to be used for someone else's gain, so I ran, and now they're hunting me." James felt a cold chill run through him. He had guessed that Ilara's past wasn't simple, but he hadn't expected it to be so complicated. Her people had chosen her for something she didn't want, something that would take away her freedom. And now she was paying the price for it. "You didn't deserve that," James said quietly, his voice filled with empathy. "No one should be forced into something like that." Ilara's eyes met his again, and for a moment, she seemed to study him, as if she was trying to understand him just as much as he was trying to understand her. "Maybe I didn't deserve it," she said slowly, "but they don't care about that. They only care about what I can do for them, what I can give them." James felt a surge of anger rise within him. It wasn't just the idea that Ilara had been forced into this life. It was the fact that someone had decided her fate for her without her consent. No one should have that kind of power over another person. "You'll be safe here," James said, his voice firm. "They won't find you." Ilara gave a faint smile, though it was filled with doubt. "I wish it were that simple." James didn't know what else to say. He couldn't promise that things would be easy, but he knew that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. He might not have much, but what he had, he was willing to give. As the evening wore on, the two of them shared a quiet dinner. The conversation turned to lighter topics, where they had come from, what they wanted for the future, and what their lives might have been like if circumstances had been different. It was strange, sitting across from someone so different, yet feeling so connected. When they finished eating, James stood to clear the dishes, and Ilara surprised him by offering to help. "You don't have to do that," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "I've got it." But Ilara was already standing, the blanket still wrapped around her. "I want to help," she insisted. "You've done so much for me already." James felt a warmth spread through him as they worked together. It was such a small thing, washing dishes, cleaning up, but in that moment, it felt like they were building something together, something that went beyond just survival. Later that night, as the apartment grew quieter, Ilara sat by the window again, staring out at the city below. The lights twinkled in the distance, and for the first time, James realized that she was no longer just a stranger. She was someone who had become important to him, someone he was willing to protect no matter what. "I don't know how long I can stay here, James," Ilara said, breaking the silence once more. "But for tonight, I'm glad I'm here." James turned from his place by the sink, wiping his hands on a towel. "You don't have to worry about that. I'll make sure you're safe. No matter what happens." Ilara turned to him, her face softening. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with something that resembled relief. "I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you for this." James smiled, his heart lifting a little. "You don't have to." As they both sat there in the silence with the distant hum of the city outside, it felt as though their lives were slowly weaving together in ways they couldn't yet understand. But whatever the future held, James knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. The morning sun filtered weakly through the small window, casting long shadows across the room. The city outside was waking up slowly, the cold still clinging to the streets, but life went on. For James, it was just another day. One that felt oddly heavy with the weight of what he had promised Alara the night before. He had told her that she would be safe here, that she could rest and recover. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. The world outside was far from kind, and there were forces in motion that he couldn't control. James sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his face, trying to shake off the exhaustion of the night before. He had stayed up late, worrying about Alara's future, about the threat she faced. She had come into his life unexpectedly, but now that she was here, he wasn't sure how to handle it. His simple, quiet life had turned upside down. He couldn't just let her go, not when she needed help. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the danger wasn't just something that could be dealt with by hiding away in his apartment. It was bigger than that. As he stood and grabbed his coat, James heard the soft sound of movement coming from the other side of the room. Alara was awake. She was sitting by the window again, staring out at the city. There was something about the way she looked that made him want to reach out to her, to offer comfort, but he wasn't sure how. They had shared so much already, but he still didn't know how to help her with the deeper things, the things she wasn't ready to talk about. "Morning," James said, walking over to the small kitchen area where he kept a pot of coffee brewing. "You sleep okay?" Alara didn't immediately answer. She sat there for a long moment, her face distant as if she was lost in her thoughts. Then, finally, she turned toward him, her eyes soft, but filled with something darker. "I didn't sleep much," she replied. "The dreams, they don't stop." James stopped what? The quiet tension between them had only grown stronger over the past few days. James and Alara had talked more about the dangers she faced, about the enemies closing in, and the future that felt more uncertain with each passing moment. The days spent in the cramped apartment were no longer a haven, not with the knowledge that Alara's past was coming for her. They couldn't hide forever, and both of them knew it. It was the evening of the 5th day when the situation became too clear to ignore. James had just returned from a supply run when he noticed something strange, a faint buzzing sound coming from the corner of the room. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there, and it was enough to make his heart skip a beat. "Alara," he called out, his voice filled with sudden alarm. She appeared at the doorway almost immediately, her expression calm but concerned. "What is it?" James didn't even have to say anything. The look in his eyes was enough. Alara turned, her eyes scanning the room before she froze. The sound was still faint but unmistakable now, a soft hum like a far-off engine idling. "It's them," she whispered, her voice a mix of dread and resignation. James's heart raced. He had known this day would come, but the reality of it was still overwhelming. The Empire had found them. "We don't have time," Alara continued, her voice steady despite the panic that had clearly settled in her chest. "We have to leave now." James felt a knot form in his stomach. He had always been a man of quiet routines, someone who preferred the safety of predictability, but there was nothing predictable about this. They were no longer just hiding. They were running. And running meant facing the unknown. It meant facing a future that neither of them could control. "Where do we go?" he asked, his voice tight. "How do we escape?" Alara's eyes narrowed as she thought quickly. "There's a resistance group on the outskirts of the city. They've helped others escape before. If we can reach them, they can get us off this planet." James nodded. "Then we go to them." "How far are they?" "Too far," Alara admitted. "But we don't have a choice. We'll have to move quickly." The urgency in her voice pushed him into action. They didn't have time to pack much. James grabbed what little they had, some food, a few changes of clothes and his jacket. Alara, already prepared to leave, grabbed a small satchel filled with the few possessions she still owned. They moved through the city like shadows, avoiding the main roads and sticking to alleyways. Every time James heard the hum of an engine overhead, he flinched. He knew the Empire's ships by their sound, their cold, menacing hums that signaled danger. It felt like they were being hunted, even though they couldn't see who was chasing them. As they reached the outskirts of the city, the streets became emptier, more desolate. The air smelled faintly of smoke and decay, a reminder of the city's decline, but James kept his eyes on the path ahead, not allowing himself to be distracted by the dying landscape. "I don't like this," he muttered under his breath, his nerves on edge. "It's too quiet." Alara, walking beside him, didn't answer. She was too focused, too aware of what they were up against. Her face was set in determination, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes, a fear that James hadn't seen before. She was scared, and for the first time he realized just how much she had been holding back. They passed through several more alleys, keeping low, moving quickly but cautiously. James was beginning to wonder how much longer they could keep up this pace. He could feel the strain in his legs, his breathing coming faster as they pushed themselves to move quicker. They couldn't afford to stop, not with the Empire so close behind them. Finally, after what felt like hours, Alara stopped. They were at the edge of the city now, and the Resistance's hideout was just beyond the crumbling wall. James could see the flicker of dim lights in the distance, but it didn't offer him much comfort. The Resistance was supposed to help them, but he didn't know if they would make it there in time. "We're almost there," Alara said, her voice strained but hopeful. "Just a little further." James nodded, pushing his exhaustion aside. "Let's go." They moved again, their pace quickening as they neared the hideout. The walls surrounding the building were high, reinforced with steel and concrete. It looked like a place meant to keep people out. But for them, it was a place that would give them a chance. As they approached the entrance, Alara raised her hand, signaling for James to stop. She approached the door carefully, knocking 3 times in a quick rhythmic pattern. There was a pause followed by a soft mechanical whir, and then the door slid open. A woman stood on the other side, her face shadowed by the dim light. "Alara," the woman said, her voice gruff but relieved. "We thought you were dead." Alara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped inside, pulling James along with her. The woman at the door stepped aside to let them in. "We're not dead." "Yet," Alara replied quietly, glancing over her shoulder at James before turning her attention back to the woman. "We need to get out of here. Now." The woman nodded. "I'll make sure the ship's ready. You two go inside and wait." James followed Alara into the hideout, trying to process what had just happened. He had no idea who these people were, how they could help them, or what they were walking into, but right now he didn't have a choice. The danger was closing in. They couldn't afford to stay in the city any longer. The hideout was much larger than he expected, filled with people who seemed to be waiting for something. They glanced up as James and Alara entered, some of them offering quiet nods of acknowledgement. James couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something much bigger than he had ever imagined. These people were part of a fight that he knew nothing about, and now he was part of it too. Alara led him to a small room at the back of the hideout. The walls were lined with old furniture, maps, and scattered papers. She sat down on a wooden chair, resting her head in her hands. For a moment, James could see the exhaustion on her face, the toll that running and hiding had taken on her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Alara looked up at him, offering a small, tired smile. "I will be, once we're off this planet." James sat down next to her, his mind racing. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't leaving her side. They had come this far together, and he wasn't about to abandon her now. As the minutes passed, the quiet murmur of voices outside grew louder. The woman from the door appeared again, her face set in grim determination. "The ship is ready," she said. "We leave in 5 minutes, no time to waste." James stood up, offering a hand to Alara. She took it, standing with him as they walked toward the door. The world outside had changed in ways they couldn't have predicted, but whatever happened next, they would face it together. And maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at a future beyond the Empire's reach. As they stepped outside, the cold night air hit them like a slap, but they didn't stop. The ship was waiting. The stars above were their only guide, and for the first time in what felt like forever, James didn't feel so alone. The hum of the engines reverberated through the metal walls of the ship as it ascended into the cold, black void of space. James sat in one of the small seats, his eyes staring out through the small window at the planet below. It had been hours since they left the city behind, and the quiet of the ship felt almost surreal. The noise and chaos of the planet had already faded into nothing, replaced by the soft hum of the ship's machinery and the distant stars blinking silently outside. James had always thought that space would feel different, more intimidating, more overwhelming. But it wasn't. Not now, not with Alara beside him. It felt peaceful, like they were moving forward, leaving behind everything that had been chasing them. Alara sat next to him, her eyes closed, her face relaxed for the first time. In days, she had fallen asleep soon after they had taken off, exhaustion weighing her down. James couldn't blame her. She had been through so much. They both had. But now, the danger was behind them. For now, at least, they were safe. James glanced at her, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest as she slept. It was hard to believe how quickly everything had changed. Just a few days ago, they had been hiding in the shadows, constantly looking over their shoulders. Now, they were free, at least for a while. But freedom came with its own challenges, and James knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. They were leaving behind a planet that had offered nothing but pain for Alara, but the universe was vast. Who knew what dangers they would face next? Who knew if they would be able to find a place where they could finally settle, away from the Empire's reach? Alara shifted slightly in her sleep, and James instinctively reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. He was surprised by how natural it felt, how instinctive. They had spent so much time in each other's company, sharing things they couldn't even put into words. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to leave her. Not now. Not ever. The soft chirping of the ship's communication system broke the silence, and James looked up to see a small, blinking light on the control panel. The voice that came through the speaker was calm, but firm. "James, Alara," the voice said, "we're approaching the station. I need you both to come to the cockpit. It's time to talk." James stood, careful not to disturb Alara as she slept, and made his way to the cockpit. The ship wasn't large, and the cockpit was just ahead. Inside, the woman who